Good morning, UUC Lakeland. Just a reminder to please wear your mask if you are in the sanctuary over your nose and your mouth for the entire time. Also, please silence your cell phone and disconnect from the Wi-Fi. Thank you.
My blood doth rise in the roots of yon oak, her sap doth run in my veins, boundless my soul like the open sky, where the stars forever hath lain, where the stars forever hath lain. My hands hold the weavings of time without end, my side as deep as the sea, beating my heart sound the measures of old, that of love's eternity, that of love, that of love, that of love's eternity. I feel the tides as they answer the moon, rushing on a far distant sand. Winging my song is the wind of my breast, and my love blows over the land. And my love, and my love, and my love blows over the land. My foot carries days of the old into new. Our dreaming shows us the way. Wondrous our faith settles deep in the earth, rising green to bring a new day. Rising green, rising green, rising green to bring a new day.
Thank you, Justin Neal and Adam Hargrove. That was Rising Green, and that was beautiful. Perhaps you remember this lesson from Marjorie Williams as she wrote it in her 1922 book, The Velveteen Rabbit. Everything that is real was imagined first. Welcome to the worship service of the UU Congregation of Lakeland. I'm Heather Norby, the Spiritual Life Director for this congregation and a seminarian at Meadville Lombard Theological School. I use the pronouns she and her. We welcome you here no matter your gender identity, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, abilities, or theological persuasion. We are a community of seekers advocating for more love and justice, building community, and creating transformation both in ourselves and in the world around us. While some of our congregants and visitors have returned to the sanctuary, many are still attending virtually. I am joining you from my mother's house in Houston, Texas, because I took an unexpected trip out of town to be with family. Streaming the service occasionally results in brief delays due to technical issues, so if this happens, you can just relax and know the tech team will get them sorted out and we will be underway momentarily. If you are joining us for the first time today, or if you have any questions, would like to get on the newsletter mailing list, or would like to find out how you can get more involved in our congregation, please reach out to Brandon Knuckles. If you are on Zoom, you can put a message in the chat and he will get back to you later so you can focus on the service now. It is a Unitarian Universalist tradition to light a chalice at the beginning of our services to create sacred space. Today, our chalice lighter is Melissa Lynn. I will read these chalice lighting words written by Robin F. Gray, entitled, "We Prepare for the Future." By the light of this chalice, we prepare ourselves for the times of triumph and times of trial that might come. We prepare ourselves to be present to one another with loving hearts, even in the most difficult of times. We prepare ourselves to make the connections that will lift us out of isolation and prepare the path of justice and equality.
Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blow in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
As we imagine our future together, it helps a great deal to have buildings where we can meet and leaders who can guide us. Keeping things running depends on all of us contributing time, talent, and treasure. Please give as you are able. In the sanctuary, we'll pass the baskets, and if you are with us virtually, please take a moment to write a check or make a donation through our PayPal link, which can be found in the chat. If you are interested in volunteering some of your time or talent, there are many ways you can contribute. We can always use help with creating and running programs, looking after and educating children, and taking care of the place. There are also a lot of simple things to do, like emptying dishwashers and weeding the patio. The list never ends. If you're interested, let one of us know after the service or send a message to the office, and we'll get it to the right person. We appreciate you so much for continuing to be a part of this community. Visionary fiction is a term developed by Walida Imarisha and Adrienne Marie Brown, leaders in today's social justice movements. The term visionary fiction distinguishes it as a kind of science fiction that has relevance toward building new, freer worlds from the mainstream strain of science fiction, which most often reinforces dominant narratives of power. Visionary fiction, according to Emerisha and Brown, encompasses all of the fantastic, with the arc always bending toward justice. They believe that this space is vital for any process of decolonization because the decolonization of the imagination is the most dangerous and subversive form there is, for it is where all other forms of decolonization are born. Once the imagination is unshackled, liberation is limitless. It is in this vein that I wrote the story we are presenting to you today. Last spring, I took a course called Community Organizing and Ethical Leadership, in which we discovered many of the underlying concepts, structures, and strategies for successful community organizing and social change. Our final assignment was to somehow illustrate a culmination of our learning, and we were given 4 options for doing so. Naturally, I chose the most creative option, and I wrote this short visionary fiction piece, a piece which also puts into story, alongside the community organizing concepts, my own personal theology about the divine nature of evolution and change, our power to shape that change, and our interrelatedness to all of life. This morning, as a story is brought to life through the dramatic reading and interpretation of Petra and Joshua Sussman, and the imaginative illustrations of Brandon Knuckles, I will weave throughout it explanations of the community organizing concepts that frame the story. I draw from the work of Saul Alinsky, who wrote Rules for Radicals in 1971 as a guide on future community organizing for the new generation of radicals emerging from the 1960s. I also draw from Charlene Carruthers, who writes about building social justice movements through a queer, Black, feminist lens. Adrienne Marie Brown, a women's rights activist and Black feminist. And Alicia Garza, civil rights activist and co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement. So when you hear the bell, it means we're breaking from the story so that I can explain my learnings and inspirations for the story from these leaders and authors. So I invite you now to center yourselves in an imagination that reaches towards justice as we step into our story at a future time when Mother Earth has decided that the only way for us to survive is to bring massive change. Part 1, the breaking apart.
Our ancestors worked with the land, sustaining the deep connections with the earth spirits from which their human lives arose. They possessed an intrinsic sense that they were co-creating with the inspirited land, for whatever was done upon it was reflected in its fertility or stubbornness to give way to life. The beauty of being human was that this miracle could be known. Ancestral wisdom operated around an understanding that not every inch of earth should be occupied by humans. The earth spirits needed space for themselves too. Space in which they, as interwoven entities of the land, could continue the essence of life, to sustain the sacred patterns and cycles of the untampered natural processes of the universe that came not from a creator, but from the co-creation of the very beginnings of matter. Space for the sacredness of existence was a requirement for life and for conscious human life to learn how to sustain itself.
Conscious life arose from a balance of cooperation and competition. But after many eons, conscious life developed the gifts of choice and expanded creativity, enough so that it started paying attention only to itself instead of the earth spirits. It was through this distorted use of these gifts that competition itself defeated cooperation. On a grand scale, humans no longer cooperated with the inspirited earth or with each other. We call this the Great Separation. And so, the ancient wisdom was forgotten, and no longer could the earth spirits find room on the land to continue their sacred cycles and patterns. The extreme eccentricity that evolved out of consciousness, like an experiment that jumped out of the petri dish before it was understood, seemed to infuse humans with the greed and the need to occupy all the land themselves. Retreat into the belly of their mother, Earth, was the only option for the earth spirits.
Depleted and forlorn, they returned to their mother, who took them back into her womb so they could heal, nourish, and prepare the process of birth. Birth is a new, beautiful new beginning, ripe with possibilities. But birth can also be chaotic and messy.
This birth was perhaps messier as a consequence of the shackles and violations of human atrocities, the submerged nuclear weapons in her waters, the cutting down of her oxygen source, the melting of her sacred balanced ice caps, the scarring of her voluptuous terrain, as if her beauty wasn't sufficient enough to sustain that subjective human feeling of satisfaction, fulfillment, elation. Humans called it happiness, but happiness was always so elusive in the cultures of competition and separation. And so it was, as Gaia, our Earth Mother, gave birth to a new beginning. The land broke apart. In 2018 CE, Africa began to split down its eastern shore. On the website, The Conversation, Lucia Perez Diaz of the Royal Holloway University of London reported, "The Earth is an ever-changing planet, even though, in some respects, change might be almost unnoticeable to us. Plate tectonics is a good example of this. But every now and then, something dramatic happens and leads to renewed questions about the African continent splitting in two."
But the change was noticeable. If only humans recognized its divine nature. If only humans knew the power they had to shape change for good. If only humans still knew how to create with the earth spirits. But those who hoarded all the power had long lost the ability to even sense their absence, leaving those who did with no power to do anything about it.
This African split should also have led to a renewed question about the possibility of dramatic events happening along and within all Earth's plates. But Africa was deemed unimportant, only something to control by those with power. For seeing Africa in all her glorious and incredibly vast and diverse beauty, and honoring her for being the cradle of humanity, sounded threatening to those wishing to keep her and her peoples under control. Ignoring the rift and the reality of our interconnectedness was an easy road to victory for fleeting happiness of the very few. Volcanoes and quakes, even in spots of land that not normally disturbed by them, began to rumble. Denial and oblivion persisted despite the fact the Mother Earth was actually going into labor.
Her water was breaking. Her birthing canals were dilating. Wild spaces would come to life once more as she released her renewed and rejuvenated earth spirits. Consciousness and creativity born out of a competition cannot oppress the wilds of a woman. A dramatic new birth, one which wasn't predicted for many millions of years yet, was happening in the time that Mother Earth decided it should happen.
The land split and began to drift. Mother Earth's groaning and moaning so frightened the humans that were not familiar with the Great Mother's ways. Panic manifested in many ways it does for conscious life. Some so drenched with the independence and ego fought each other, killing one another as though there would only be room for the most fearless and brutal of warriors, as if defeating one another meant the power to defeat Mother Earth. Disconnection and separation were so severe for those warriors that they lost all ability to hear the ancient ones cry, hear the ancient cries of Gaia. Their imaginations knew nothing outside of powering over. They could focus only on winning, as if death to all others would ensure their survival. They failed to see that this breaking apart of the earth was actually life rushing in. They fought their identity only in the elimination of what was other. Some folks huddled together, too frozen from fear to leave what they already knew. Cooperation with one another was their only hope of living through this tumultuous birth. Together, they would have to learn how to reestablish a life in this time of chaos and instability, opening up their minds, hearts, and souls to new possibilities. And then there were some who fled and sought shelter in regions that appeared to be stable, returning once again, as if through instinct, to a land which they were made to co-create with it for their own survival and to assist in the birthing and infant care of a transforming earth.
Transformative justice is an imagining, a future goal for all, a dream to live now, for communities working towards a world that sustains life. Transformative justice moves away from punitive justice so that the cycles of harm and abuse are ended. Transformative justice humanizes those that have been dehumanized, adds depth to what it means to be a complex human being, moving us away from the restrictions that binary thinking places upon our humanity. Adrienne Marie Brown writes about transformative justice as transforming the conditions that make injustice possible. In this sense, I use the metaphor of Mother Earth giving birth as a form of transformative justice, which doesn't destroy or punish humans for sickening her or not recognizing the gifts of interconnectedness, but rather changes the conditions that humans have to work with so they can rediscover how life works and find their own humanity once again. In this birth that I've created here, the continents and thus the people are moving closer together. My story will continue with the introduction of the main character, Ren. As an exploration of gender fluidity, I chose not to write from a specifically female perspective, but to imagine and bring my own male aspects into the story. Thus, the character uses they, them pronouns. As we enter back into the story, we find Ren relearning and reconnecting to the wisdom of natural forces, as many organizers, including Charlene Carruthers and Adrienne Marie Brown, understand the necessity of connecting with the land we live on if we ever want to reach liberation for all. Let us step into part 2 of the story, the healing.
Rin sat by their small fire in the center of a ring. The earth spirits were strong once again after a full cycle around the sun, all 4 seasons having been able to bring back life-sustaining processes. Rin and the earth spirits found one another as they healed together after the great breaking apart. It was impossible to know how long ago that was. Some great amount of time earlier. Perhaps it was 1 or 2, maybe 5 years? Or could it possibly have been more? Wren didn't hear the spirits clearly at first, although they were there to cradle Wren with the love and life as soon as they arrived at the cave. Wren was distraught, wrecked, nearly lifeless when they slipped on the algae-covered rock under their feet and landed at the entrance of what was to become their new home, a cave with impenetrable darkness, persistent dampness, yet offering the comfort of an entrance after miles of loss and loneliness. Wren had indeed run for miles inland away from the rising water. After watching that water rise up from the once serene beach to drown the only partner they had ever loved, Bree. Resting in the cave, Wren felt safe. Sleep came and dreams sang, hints from the earth spirits communicating to Wren that they were not as alone as it might have seemed. After some time, Wren was awakened by a sudden silence. The moaning and groaning of Mother Earth's labor had ceased. The sounds of a land awakening and spirited once again began to tickle Wren's ears. Inside their body, Wren felt their soul begin to question and to feed their fuzzy brain with enough curious energy that they could lift themselves up off the damp, mossy floor of the protective cave. Wren crawled towards the light with an increasingly growing sense of wonder. Like a small child, Wren felt naive as they approached a world which they might know nothing about. But more curious to Wren, or was it more unsettling, was the question of, who am I now in this world?
In 1971, Saul Alinsky wrote about the essential quest of a leader organizer to find their own identity and purpose. Why am I here, one should ask. Finding one's own self-interest in the movement is not only essential, but unavoidable. Charlene Carruthers stated in her 2018 book that everyone invested in collective liberation must answer the following questions, critical to determining the health and success of our movements. Who am I? Who are my people? What do we want? What are we building? Are we ready to win? The question of who am I is the first of these critical questions. And so this is where I begin the story with Wren, so that they may begin to understand how to frame their work and purpose. As Carruthers wrote, it takes time to digest the reality of the world we live in and make sense of how we are situated in the broader human experience. Let us return to the story.
Wren was already familiar with being unfamiliar and a world not yet created for them. To break apart the thinking that held dear the gender binary and replace it with a spectrum, with an array of unique possibilities, was experience that helped Wren grow skills in listening to the fear and confusion of others. Tiring work as it was, breakthroughs were invigorating. To help others create a vision of a different world, one that feels loving, comfortable, healthy, and creative for all, gave Wren purpose and hope. Little by little, Wren felt that they were pulling the weeds from the path toward a just future and creating the conditions of equality and justice by transforming hearts, minds, and worldviews. Wren touched people through cultivating relationships with them, and through that, Wren received the love they also desired. Wren wanted a better world for themselves, of course, but they also hoped to assist in the creation of good ancestors for future generations. Wren knew that shaping change was divine. Wren's place in the world was to open people up to this divine power. Wren was a translator of the divine, showing people the way to the holy. But where were those transformed people now? Did they know how to survive the breaking apart? Who would Wren be without other people and without the sacred task that they had so earnestly endeavored to carry out? Wren felt grief weighing heavily in their chest, pushing down the sense of wonder they had just previously felt. Not only was their partner, Bree, ripped away from them in the waves, but they didn't even feel like they could know and trust themselves out here in the unknown, alone. Wren wasn't even sure how long they had been sleeping and how much they had aged.
The light was strong outside of the cave, as if it possessed a magnetic force. It seemed radiant and alive, as if the spirits of Wren's ancestors were smiling on them, begging them forth. Wren lifted himself up out of the cave into the warm and welcoming light, tiptoeing into the newness of the world and into the newness of their becoming. A gentle breeze touched Wren's face, reassuring like a mother's touch. They stood gazing upon a strangely silent and new world, scanning the landscape for what might seem still familiar. Trees, oaks and maples, pines and birch, still there, but standing in unfamiliar patterns as many had fallen. Wren heard some rustling in the leaves as if other life had survived as well, but yet they couldn't see whether it might be birds or squirrels or perhaps rabbits or chipmunks, bears, wolves, deer to hunt. Wren had many wonderings about what this presence of life they felt and heard could be. Perhaps it was something they didn't even know existed before the breaking apart. There would be much to explore, but even more nagging, much to learn about sustaining their own body, mind, and soul.
Six months later.
There was a biting chill in the air that night. Wren had spent the day collecting dry logs from downed trees that didn't survive the breaking apart. Those downed trees were a gift from the mother, for not only did they provide wood for Wren's fires, but on them grew what had become Wren's favorite food, morels. They planned to cook up some of the morels they had dried at summer's end over this winter's night's fire. Wren had also been saving a bottle of sherry that they scavenged from an abandoned house about a half a mile down the road on the ridge. It would add moisture and flavor to the morels, and a few sips would no doubt help to keep them warm throughout the night. It also might help settle the anxiety they were feeling from something they noticed at that house. Wren had been looking for a mirror at the house.
They figured seeing themselves might help them to gain some sense of the time that had gone by while they slept in the cave. Wren thought that perhaps a mirror could also be a good tool for self-reflection and healing. But strangely, the mirrors in the house were gone. Not just fallen and broken, there were no pieces. Gone, ripped from the walls. It looked like a strange occurrence that left Wren with an unsettling feeling that some intelligent being had been there looking for mirrors. But what for, Wren could not imagine. Luckily, however, the house Wren scavenged from did provide them with the comfort of blankets. Among them, a beautifully hand-sewn quilt, seemingly made from the clothing of someone's beloveds. Wren treasured it. And as they wrapped it around their cold body, they were reminded of how love wraps itself around one when surrounded by family. It reminded Wren that love was still their guide, their moral compass. It reminded Wren that Wren was indeed love, manifested in human form, and that they still deserved to be loved. The quilt somehow filled in the lonely gap that they carried with them day after day now. It lightly filled the heartache that existed from Bree's absence.
Wren took the dried morels out of the sack where they had been stored, handling each one with care. They remembered how quickly they grew. What a delightful surprise it was. When Wren first found the morel colony growing on the downed log by the stream, they were starving. Wren harvested every last one and had taken them back home, built a fire, and ate the entire crop. Afterwards, Wren realized that perhaps in their greed to consume them, they were not supporting the needs of their future self. What would they eat tomorrow? Wren felt as though they had not only cheated themselves, but violated the spirit of the morels by taking them all. It was one of the lessons of interdependence that was learned before the breaking apart, but that they had forgotten in that hungry moment. However, the wild dreams that came to them that night helped Wren stir some forgiveness into their lonely, starving soul. It was a process of healing in which Wren realized that the conditions of guilt and shame did not grow love. It was up to Wren now to create new conditions in which they could grow self-love and compassion. For that was all they had. Or was it?
To Wren's surprise, Gaia was forgiving and generous with the morels, as when Wren had returned to the log 6 days later. An entire new colonies had sprung up ready for harvesting. This time, Wren was more deliberate in how they harvested them, selecting only the bigger ones. Wren returned each day to pay attention to how the remaining ones changed. Wren learned who the morels were and what their becoming was like. Wren experimented with some to see if they could encourage growth in different places, in different ways. Wren listened closely, and with the assistance of the earth spirits with whom they had become familiar, Wren heard the needs of these precious morels. Finding what the morels loved and what their place in the forest was and was not, Wren was able to discover the joy in creating a place for them to live. It was a process of experimenting and a willingness to make mistakes, of paying attention to growth for the sake of growth, of gaining an intimate knowledge so that Rin could best care for the Morels and for themselves. The Morels gave life back to Rin as their body absorbed the life-giving properties. And through this relationship with Mother Earth's gifts, Rin had come to know themselves again. They found that the core of who they were hadn't changed, despite the grandiose shifting of the earth. At Rin's core still was love. What did shift, expand, and deepen was Rin's sense for how to reach their vision of a healing and free world for all, to create from paying attention so that they could organize, nurture, know the many ways to love and be loved. Rin wasn't just finding the holy or translating the sacred. Rin was creating it. Rin's sense of possibilities had expanded just by being in relationship with the Morels and their generous gifts and their generous spirits. After the dried morels and sherry, Rin wrapped himself in the quilt and laid down in the darkness of dark caves, their home, co-created by them and the mysterious earth spirits of life that had come to live there too after Gaia's chaotic birth. Rin dreamt on that wintry night about the seeds that the earth spirits had been planting for them to discover come spring.
Charlene Carruthers and Adrienne Marie Brown name healing justice as an essential element of organizing. We must tend to our own gardens, as when we come together in groups to make change, our collective struggle is often undermined by all that has not been dealt with emotionally. It is critical that we stop punishing ourselves. We reckon with our emotions, heal our own hearts and souls so that we can come together and heal under a culture of care. So here we see Ren paying attention to themselves, and make this for an intimate and forgiving relationship with the earth. The story now jumps forward in time to the fire on the warm night once again.
Rin listened to the crackling fire. The fire spirits knew of knowing their own mind and heart even more than before the breaking apart, and of it strengthening their body by the gifts from the earth. Rin was ready to search for other conscious life. Would it be human? What kind of human would it be? Would they rediscover those they had known before? The fire spirits were ready to answer some of these questions for them. Rin closed their eyes and centered themselves in possibility, opening themselves to whatever the new truth might be, opening up to divine change. Rin listened to the voices of the spirits speak to them.
The continents had drifted closer to one another and were on the verge of reconnecting fully. Millions had survived, but cities had collapsed. The city people were organizing themselves, reawakening to new ways, new patterns, new structures, new behaviors, all rooted in cooperation, mostly out of necessity. They could travel easily between continents now, as the water passages had drastically narrowed. It allowed for personal observations, experience of one another, sharing of stories and new possibilities for sustaining life. The calling to sustain life was so strong among the people after the breaking apart. life's fragility and life's wonders had been revealed in the birth. And the fact that it was a birth and not a punishment had been realized as people began to uncover love for one another. These conditions of birth and renewal that Mother Earth gifted the people nourished in empathy, hope, joy, and love, even through all the loss. Listening and learning was becoming a part of widespread culture. Strong creative organizers were emerging. In fact, these were the people who had initially run to find safe harbors within the earth, much like Wren. They had returned to their home cities healed and with a strong calling to use the lessons learned while in relationship with the earth spirits. Their healing knowledge helped to remind the people that life was found in relationships, not in punishment, guilt, and shame. Many taught how to grow food. Some taught tool-making, art, and many others held spiritual healing rituals around crackling fires. All the organizers had reconnected with the earth spirits, amplifying their voices and returning them to the land and to the people. It was through this recognition, this reconnection, that they were able to organize what had been unorganized, finding fresh paths to the future by addressing the possibilities of power, stretching imagination beyond powering over. The knowledge they had gathered was akin to Wren's, and once Wren returned and found these other organizers, they would know where in the puzzle their own learnings would fit. But not all was glorious, as not all conscious life will ever have the ability to untie itself from fear and greed and reconnect to the web of love that can nourish a fragile ego. The fighters, although diminished greatly in number, had called a truce once the moaning and groaning of the great mother had ceased. There was one man in particular who declared himself a leader, for he had access and power to something the others didn't. A laboratory that held the secrets for how man could play God. Before the breaking apart, scientists had already experimented with implanting other species with human DNA. Their experiments had gone further than was publicly approved or even known. Funded largely by this newly declared leader, his money meant nothing now after Gaia's generous birth, a gift that he perceived as punishment. Although he found power in holding the key to playing God, or at least his version of God, or at least his version of a wrathful, ungrateful, and irresponsible God, a God that only served to hoard power with no clear goal of what he actually wanted beyond that. A God that did not wish to change.
The fire spirits paused so that Wren could absorb the information about the new world beyond the forest. Wren had questions. Could the irresponsible self-made God actually control what he was determined to create? Or would animal species infused with human DNA become life out of their own shaping now that their consciousness was raised? Wouldn't they still be connected to the earth spirits? And what role would the healers play in all of this? And the communities that were cooperating and rebuilding? Would the fighters even be able to sustain their own community, let alone a long-term plan for some kind of domination? These were questions that the earth spirits and the fire spirits could not answer. Rin knew they would only be answered with connection, attention, and time. Rin knew once again why their body, mind, and spirit existed in this new world, to create an existence that would be resilient to the harm of competitors. Part 3, the connecting. Rin was ready to find the cooperative people. They gathered the rest of their dried morels as they would serve as a bridge to sharing stories with the people Rin encountered. Rin's plan was to share how they got to understand the morels, how they grew, what they loved, and how they nourished life. Through their sharing, Rin hoped to open up others so that they may reveal their own ways of growing and loving. Rin wanted to collect the visions of many people and bring them to the other organizers like themselves, so they may paint a picture of a future that included all. And Rin knew that this shared net of power would provide a force that could shape and co-create change more than any self-made, small-minded God could ever imagine.
Shares his ideas of an organizer as one who is curious with a purpose, one who tries to make meaning out of an ever-changing life. It is with this curiosity instead of fear that Ren moves forward. She is wondering, in accordance with Charlene Carruthers' second critical question for organizing, who are my people? And once she finds them, she understands that a new and peaceful world demands decentralized power. Essential to Saul Alinsky's work was creating a mass organization that seizes power from the few and gives it to the people. Alicia Garza writes about giving people a sense of their own power in order to establish a strong base, creating an intricate web of organizations, and being leaderful. Carruthers lists 3 collective commitments our movements must take up, and one is building many strong leaders. Ren has set off to connect and build a leaderful movement for love and transformation. Let us return to the story 3 months later.
Ren approached an encampment on the banks of the river. This was the river that used to lead to the beach, where Bree was brought back into the mix of possibilities and potentialities of matter to recreate itself. The shelters in the encampment were constructed from the remains of buildings that towered over the houses in the city before the breaking apart. They were a creative mix of materials with textures, colors, and shapes that dazzled and reflected the unique personalities that occupied them, creating a gestalt that tickled the imagination.
A person walked toward Ren, reached out their hand, and said, "Hi, I'm Mike. Welcome to Riverside."
Hi, Mike. I'm Ren from the Earth Spirits Circle. I'm collecting stories about creating after the breaking apart. This is a great encampment you've all built here. I'd love to sit down and learn more about it. Do you have the time?
"You bet," Mike replied, eager to share.
One of the biggest lessons that I am learning in my own life is to meet people where they are. Saul Alinsky wrote that as an organizer, I start from where the world is, as it is, not as I would like it to be. This is a theme we encountered throughout the semester with many of the organizers, and it goes hand in hand with Adrienne Marie Brown's instructions to move at the speed of trust. Now, back to the story. 2 years later.
Mike was brewing the ritual tea at his seat by the fire. Rem was rehydrating the morels with sherry. As these offerings were being passed around, the people would tell their part of the rebuilding and co-creating story. Every time it was told, new voices added, and the story of who they were and who they were becoming was growing, changing, becoming more beautiful. The people saw in themselves courage and curiosity and a deep sense of joy in sharing the truth. This was the ritual that the Riverside community, joined by several neighboring communities, told before they contemplated how to move forward.
Tonight's moving forward would be unusual and perhaps difficult. Around tonight's fire sat someone new, someone almost human, but someone with overwhelming feline characteristics. Rin detected a radiance that felt much like the earth spirits that held them in safety after they landed in the cave.
I am here to share the secret to humility, this curious being stated.
This new feline human reached into their bag and took out a small mirror.
Building bridges between our divisions, I reach out to you, will you reach out to me? With all of our voices and all of our visions, friends, we could make such sweet harmony.
Building bridges between our divisions, I reach out to you, will you reach out to me? With all of our voices and all of our visions, I reach out to you, will you reach out to me? With all of our voices and all of our visions, I reach out to you, such sweet harmony. With all of our voices and all of our visions, I reach out to you, will you reach out to me? With all we could make such sweet harmonies. Friends, we could make such sweet harmony.
I learned something this week. I learned that when you give up power and creative control and you let other people get in on the vision, wonderful things can happen. The vision grows beyond your own imagination and starts to become a reality. Thank you to Brandon and Petra, Joshua and Adam and Justin for contributing to the vision. And thank you to all the rest of you for listening and allowing yourself to be touched by the vision and our experimenting, and to be curious about the spectrum of possibilities and the potential to bring about change. Please extinguish the chalice with me. We extinguish this chalice, but not the light of truth, the warmth of love, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts and out into the world. if you'd like to be a part of this UUCL community and to share in the vision, please join us during our week as well. On Mondays, we have women's group. On Tuesdays, we meet on the patio for coffee clutch at 10 a.m. We have book club once a month on Tuesday evenings, I believe. We have a choir that you can join. And we have lots of work around the UUCL grounds that needs to be done. So please feel free to contact me or Brandon to see how you can get involved and help us grow our vision. Thank you. Oh, there's a board meeting today at 1 p.m. on Zoom as well, and you're welcome to come observe and see how we talk about the business of the church. And we do have one more video, which I was told by Petra came to her in a dream the other night as she was maybe dreaming, I think she said somehow connected to the story that she was reading today, and that at the end of that story, at the end of that dream, this song came into her head. And so we're going to play that for you today as we wrap up our worship time together. Thank you.
I'm gonna lay down my burden